All right, part 4. So, when we look at the iron law of prohibition, what that basically means is that when you prohibit something, you incentivize its strongest form being sold in the market. What that means is, during alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, people didn't drink Miller Lite because if you're going to smuggle something, you're not going to smuggle 4% Miller Lite. You're going to smuggle 100% moonshine. And with the iron law of prohibition, you have no idea what you're getting. Like when things are legal and regulated, I can be pretty sure if I drink a Miller Lite, I'm getting 4% Miller Lite. If alcohol is illegal, however, I'm probably getting moonshine, but am I actually getting regulated moonshine, or am I getting some cocktail being sold as moonshine? I have no idea because there's no regulation, right? When we think of marijuana being regulated, the initial thinking back in the 2010s-ish was like, oh my gosh, if we, sell marijuana legally and we tax it, that sin tax I talked about, then we'll make money and we'll be able to pave teachers and pave roads and pay teachers with this money. But the truth is, a lot of the money that came from the legalization of marijuana, that tax, goes right back into regulating it and being like, hey, we gotta check it out, make sure you're not doing this half-hearted with moldy conditions. So, when you legalize something, you regulate it, that is definitely a safer way to bring things to market and the way to extinguish a legal market. There are no more moonshiners, really. They don't really exist anymore because we have a legal, regulated market for alcohol. Now, there are still a lot of DUIs, and alcohol has its problems, right? I think there's something like 41,000 alcohol-related liver disease deaths as of 5 years ago. So alcohol has its problems. But it was likely far more problematic during Prohibition when, you didn't know what you were drinking because there was no regulation, and you incentivized, by prohibiting it, bringing in its strongest form. And that happens with all drugs, right? So when we think of making heroin illegal, cocaine illegal, what we are doing is we're incentivizing fentanyl. So fentanyl, by the way, let's talk about that a little bit. There are generally 4 waves of the opioid addiction. When Bayer invented heroin, we put in cough syrup. And then, in the 1980s with the opioids, they were generally regarded as very addictive, and they were not as strong, and they were prescribed in smaller doses. So in the 1980s, we looked at opiates and we're like, oh man, these are dangerous. Let's prescribe them in small doses and not too much. Then OxyContin in the 1990s came around and they're like, hey, I think we're under treating pain, and truly we were. So we can probably treat pain a little bit better. And so what Big Pharma did is they took Dr. Herschel Jick, I believe, was working for the New Haven School of Medicine, and he wrote an article that said of I think it was 3,000 patients he saw, only 8 of them got addicted, or only of 1,000 patients, only 3 of them got addicted in the hospital. So he's like, I think we're under treating pain. So basically, it was less than 1%. Less than 1% of people leave a hospital addicted to pain pills, which, good. What Big Pharma heard in that article, which was just an article, that research shows that only 1% of people get addicted or less get addicted to opiates. So opiates are basically virtually non-addictive, and we are way under treating pain. So they made a stronger opiate with OxyContin, which was oxycodone continuous release, pushed it to the market as virtually non-addictive, cherry-picking this stat from an article written by Dr. Herschel Jick, and basically bribe doctors to prescribe it. So that's the first wave of the opioid addiction is Purdue Pharma produces OxyContin, and it is sold to people in mass and misadvertised as virtually non-addictive. Then heroin hits the streets because you have people addicted to oxycodone. It gets expensive to afford. Heroin is much cheaper, and heroin spreads from the inner cities out to the suburbs. And that's where you see black tar heroin coming in from Mexico and them having a system where they did Operation Tar Pit, which was the biggest heroin bust of all time. And every cell that they busted was up and running the next day. And the challenge is, anytime you have a drug bust, you know what happens? Murders go up. Because all you do is disrupt an established hierarchy, and as the hierarchy has to reestablish itself, people kill each other to have that street corner position. So the second wave of opioid addiction was kind of your black tar heroin coming in from Mexico, from Jalisco, with people traveling in from Mexico just to be able to afford blue jeans for themselves or provide for their families, because working in the sugarcane fields was not producing a lot. But the other product they had was opium, and they could sell that here in the United States. And they were pretty discreet about it and pretty good about it. They weren't flashy, right? And so they would go to methadone clinics, offer people in line a taste of their kind of black tar heroin, and we see the second wave of the heroin coming in after Purdue Pharma. Then we see carfentanil and fentanyl now. Carfentanil is elephant tranquilizer. Fentanyl comes in largely from unregulated labs in China, comes across our borders. It can be ordered through the dark web, and it comes to people, and all they do is mix it in magic bullet blenders and then sell it. And the challenge is, if someone dies from a batch of heroin or fentanyl, which is largely displaced heroin now because it's stronger, heroin, less pure, fentanyl, more pure, stronger. When you prohibit something, you incentivize the strongest form. That's why fentanyl has displaced heroin in recent years. The challenge is you have people who are amateur chemists mixing fentanyl in magic bullet blenders, and they almost want to have an incentive to make their dosing so someone overdoses, because it is perversely attractive to someone to buy a batch from which someone has overdosed, because then they know it's a strong batch. So that is, a big challenge here, and that's kind of the third wave was, this kind of fentanyl. And the fourth wave was this mix of fentanyl and methamphetamine that largely led to a lot of homelessness, but people were slowly mixing fentanyl into methamphetamine to even kind of get people insidiously hooked on opiates when really they were, trying to get stimulants. And I think it was called like a speedball, which was like the combination of those things, which became very popular. And so now we see a lot of methamphetamine on the rise, we see a lot of fentanyl on the rise, and we see a lot of deaths of despair on the rise, which I have a whole nother video about. But when we get back to looking at some things here on the higher level, I mentioned that, what we typically have in costs from, public related health costs from addiction issues is much greater than we ever get in like the tax of it. I once heard a study, and this is probably about 10 years old, but we spent $4 billion on treatments, job incentives, and education when it came to addiction. We spent $40 billion on policing and punishing. And to put that in perspective, it costs about $35,000 a year to keep someone in jail, right? And when we look at those jails, at one point I saw a statistic that said 70% of Westmoreland jail was addicted to opiates. So what the Portugal model does is it takes that on its head, and flips it on its head. Rather than spending $40 billion on policing and punishing, it put $40 billion into treatment, education, and job incentives, and used only $4 billion for policing and punishing. And the results were much better. Their heroin problem went down by like 50%, right? And they even had some clinics like in Vancouver that give free heroin away. And you think, oh my God, that sounds awful. That sounds terrible, right? But the heroin you get is regulated, so you're not gonna overdose. And when you go there and it's free and it's consistent to get, you don't have to run the lifestyle. And the lifestyle is, how do I get the money to pay for my heroin? And that becomes your entire life, right? When you can go to a clinic and get it for free, you do it, it's medically supervised, and then you leave the clinic and you have the rest of the day to do things with your day. So I'm not saying I support that, because I think, perhaps, methadone or something else might be a better alternative than heroin. But the concept is that if you can remove the lifestyle of chasing and committing crimes or being forced into kind of some sort of pseudo sex slavery to commit, whatever you need to do to get these drugs when you're addicted, you can restore better citizenship. You can give people that opportunity to be better citizens when they're not chasing that drug and having to live that lifestyle. So a couple things I'm going to mention here, and then we're going to be done in the next 7 minutes. One is the grieving mongoose. When we look at the real cause of addiction, you hear the term ACE come up. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Events. Now, trauma is more associated with being addicted than being overweight is to heart disease. So think about that. Trauma is more strongly correlated and associated with being addicted than being overweight is to heart disease. So when you look at someone's ACE score, there's an actual way to score these adverse childhood events. The higher the score, the more likely they are to be addicted. And here's how that makes sense. They did this study where they looked at a mated pair of mongoose, and they were happy and they're chilling, living in their environment, and in their environment is intoxicating mushrooms. But they mostly shunned those mushrooms when they were a mated pair. But then a landslide once killed one of the mongoose, and the other one was left alone and grieving. They went through an adverse event. So you know what it did? It went intoxicating mushroom eating crazy. This happens with mongoose. It happens with us. When you go through hard adverse events and you lose a significant bond, you try to bond with other things, right? Like, people want to bond, but when you put people in a jail cell and you isolate them and then you give them a felony and then they can't bond with the larger community because that felony stops them from being a good citizen, they're going to continue to bond with whatever they can, which is often drugs. So what the Portugal model does is it gives people a second chance. It gives them job opportunities. It gets them bonded back into society, back into the healthy rat park, and doesn't just put them alone in their cage. So the rat park study, I think you guys both watched the video, but the rat park study basically is this. If you have a rat alone in a box and you give it a choice of water bottles, it's going to choose the heroin or cocaine-laced water bottle until it dies. But if you take that same rat and you put it in Rat Park, where it has access to a bunch of other rats in a nice lush environment and natural sunlight and good rat food, so it can have socialization and sex and a rat community, and then you introduce heroin or cocaine into one of the water bottles, they will mostly shun it. They'll consume it 75% less and none of them die. So that's why I think we need to look at addiction as more of a bonding issue than we do even a chemical issue, right? Yes, there are real chemical hooks, and that's probably about 20% of the argument. But 80% is someone's environment, right? How are their bonds? How's their ACE score? If their trauma is high and their bonds are low, that's a quick script for addiction. To counter that, can we get their bonds better and help them work through some of that trauma? Right? Can we restore good citizenship and help them, find jobs and feel important and feel secure? So, a couple more things here. Covered the Portugal model. Not everyone who uses is addicted. One approach to treating addiction is motivational interviewing. And you can ask people, one point I remember I had a client and I asked him, rather than saying, you need to stop using heroin, you're going to die, the fear-based old school model, I kind of asked, well, how much heroin would you like to use? And I respected his autonomy. And he was taken aback. He's like, I've never had a counselor ask me that. Like, you're okay with me using it? I'm like, it's not my call. It's yours, right? So we came up with a game plan. And because I respected his autonomy and his values, he eventually built enough trust with me that he quit using illicit heroin and tapered off methadone. We don't need to tell people how to live their lives. We need to use motivational interviewing techniques to help them figure out their own values, and then be a coach in helping them, after we figure out their own values, align their life actions with those values. I have whole videos on Deaths of Despair. I'd encourage you to watch them because that's going to help you understand this more at a macro level. It used to be that car accidents would hover around, 40,000 people, and overdoses were lower than that. But now overdoses are up at 110,000, way more than car accidents. Suicides are at 47,000, way over or more than car accidents. Alcoholic liver disease is at 41,000, over car accidents. So car accidents used to be very prominent, but now these deaths of despair are trumping and even threefolding the amount of car accidents anymore. So I believe MI works great. I think even Medicaid-assisted treatment still comes with a stigma. So like if you're prescribed antidepressants are supposed to cure serotonin imbalance. It's a medical issue. If you're prescribed Suboxone, that's supposed to help cure an endorphin issue, right? Like our brains hijacked by drugs, become unbalanced and need rebalanced. That's the whole story of addiction from a medical chemical perspective. Our brains hijacked by drugs, shut down, go into hibernation, stop producing the natural stuff as much because we're reliant on the chemical and need rebalanced. But for MAT, we make it so that like if you need methadone, you have to come in every day for 90 days. And you have to pee in a cup. And you need pre-authorization. And then maybe after a year, you can come in 3 times a week. The only reason we treat addiction treatment different than mental health treatment is because we look at addiction as criminal, still not medical. And I think to move beyond that, we need to look at addiction as societal and look at Purdue Pharma's role and look at, how we're designing our society. But a step in the right direction would be like, let's just even look at it as medical and get it on par. If you have a depression issue, you see a PCP, you don't need to go to a specialist, and you prescribe something for a month, and you're not pushed to taper, you're not stigmatized, you don't get dirty looks at the pharmacy, but we still have that with Suboxone and methadone and other things. So with that, the old school way to intervene was very much like cut them off, like stop the source of enabling. And there still is that's a good thing. You don't want to continue to enable people. But you also have to let people know they're loved, that you care about them, and give them a path to recovery, and let them know you value them as a person and you value them, you believe in them. So with that, I realized this was put together in many parts in an hour in a morning, but I hope you get the chance to watch all 4 of these parts and that it was helpful in your learning. Thanks for watching.